times, nurses and doctors are the last ones to speak to people before they pass away. And when you're on the brink of death, you can say anything you want without consequences. Hello everyone and welcome back to our channel. I'm your host Emily, and today we're counting down part 2 of our list of the top 10 dark last words heard by nurses. Now if you haven't seen part 1, go check it out because Kennedy hosted it and she did a great job as usual. Now let's get on with the list. Number 10. I'm scared. A Reddit user wrote of their experience saying he was an elderly gentleman with a worsening congestive heart failure who was incapacitated. His wife put him in hospice and he was comfort measures only. I was at the nurse's station and I can hear him starting to gasp for air. I walked into the room and he was struggling to breathe. I put my stethoscope up to his back, but I already knew what was happening. His lungs were full of fluid. I sat him up in bed and he stared at me, eyes wide open, head tilted slightly back, with a facial expression of full-blown panic. I'm scared. Immediately after he said the words, his oxygen mask started filling up with pinkish red frothy foam running down his face and dripping onto his gown. He was dead within minutes, and all I could do was watch him. Now that sounds absolutely terrifying, and I can't imagine the pure terror that old man felt, and it's a shame that the last thing he felt was panic. Number 9. Tell my mom. This online user said I'm not a nurse but an EMTB on the 911 unit. We got a call about a hit and run and cops were on the scene first. Some guy and his girlfriend had gotten into a fight in the parking lot. It ended with him running over her, then backing up over her. She wasn't doing well and her vitals were tanking. We loaded her up and she kept mumbling, "Tell my mom, please tell my mom." Naturally, I figured she was asking us to let her mom know that she was hurt. The hospital takes care of that, so I put it out of my mind as we were working over her. She flatlined before we arrived and they didn't get her back. My partner was finishing up her paperwork and we turned to give her wallet back to the staff. The nurse on duty, who I knew well, was reading a dirty piece of paper. She looked disgusted. When I asked what was up, she simply put the piece of paperwork down. It was a letter that was picked up near her purse on the scene. She had gotten accepted into college. And that's what the girl wanted her mom to know, that she got into college. Now that's just an absolutely heartbreaking story and I can't imagine being in their shoes. Number 8. Don't let me die. This story is more heartbreaking than scary, but an online user said, when I was a senior resident, a young man, late 20s, was admitted for pneumonia. He got worse quickly and I was called to his room to help while being on call that night. He was having trouble breathing and needed to be intubated. I explained all this to him and that I would sedate him and then get him intubated so we could help him breathe. He agreed and we got everything ready. The last thing he said to me was, "Doc, please don't let me die," and I told him I would do my very best. I got him intubated and transferred to the ICU, and a few weeks later I was on call covering the ICU and he was barely hanging on. I knew he would not make it through the night. He went into VFib several times and I was able to bring him back, but only briefly. He was just too sick and he died shortly after that. It was horrible talking to his mother and girlfriend and comforting them, knowing the last words he ever spoke were to me, saying, "Please don't let me die." Number 7. I'm sorry. This user said, my buddy who went on to be a doctor had an elderly female patient, probably 90 to 100 years old. Her daughter left the room to get coffee and my buddy had to check her vitals. They were normal. She woke up, smiled, and got teary-eyed. She said, "I knew you'd come back for me. I'm sorry I didn't marry you. My family wouldn't let me. But I will now, I promise." My buddy just held her hand and smiled. She laid back and closed her eyes and her heart stopped. She had a DNR and was gone just like that. Now her daughter had no clue what she meant. Her husband had been dead for 10 years and they were married since they were 20. My buddy doesn't know if it's relevant, but we're black and maybe she was in love with a black guy a long time ago because she was looking right at him when she spoke. IDK is weird. All I know is that is so sad and that her last words were filled with regret. Number 6. Angel. This Reddit user said, I'm a nurse and was previously working at an assisted living community on the dementia Alzheimer's unit. My very favorite patient had been declining pretty steadily, so I was checking on him very frequently. We would have long chats and joke around with each other, but in the last 2 weeks of his life, he stopped talking completely and didn't really acknowledge conversation directed at him at all. I finished my medication rounds for the evening and went to see him before I left. I told him I was leaving for the night and that I'd see him the following day, and he looked me in the eyes and smiled so genuinely and said, "You look like an angel." I thought it was so sweet because he had not seen lucid in weeks, and he died the next morning. It really messed with me. Now that would mess with me too because wow, but at least he found some comfort within this nurse. Number 5. What day is it? Okay, so this post doesn't really follow the guidelines of this title, but hear me out. This user said, I don't care that I'm not a nurse, but this was said by my dad to the nurse, so close enough. Backstory, my dad had MS. He'd had it since he was 18, diagnosed at 20, married my mom at 24, had me at 29, and died 15 days short of 45. 6 months before that, he was put on hospice. He and my mom were discussing funeral arrangements, and my mom jokingly said, "You know, Tim, the best thing you could do would to be die on a Wednesday. That way we can have the body prepared on Thursday, the viewing on Friday, and the memorial on Saturday so more people could come." Now the morning we got the call that it was time, my mom, 2 sisters, and I were about 5 minutes too late. After we said our goodbyes, the nurse pulled my mom aside and asked her if the day had any significance. It's not even 6 a.m. yet, so mom doesn't even know what day it is, much less if it's important. The nurse tells her it's May 21st. No, nothing is coming to mind. The nurse told her that the previous day he kept asking what day it was and they tell him it was the 20th. He looked irritated but accepted it. That morning he asked what day it was and they said it's Wednesday, May 21st. He smiled, squeezed his favorite nurse's hand, and was gone almost immediately. It was Memorial Day weekend and we did just as he and mom had planned. And despite many friends being out of town for the holiday, we had over 250 people show up at the memorial service, overflowing the tiny church more than it had ever been filled. To his dying day, he was trying to make things easier for our family. I miss him. Now that's honestly so sweet and I can't believe it worked out that way, and I can tell that their dad was a great person. Number 4. I'll die. Now this story is just freaky. It goes, came into an early shift and was handed over a patient who'd been very anxious and had a panic attack overnight. He was anxious all morning but OBS all fine, ECG fine, so I just asked someone to sit with him to keep an eye on him, reassure him for me. He gets worse, really panicky, heavy breathing. He's on his side in the fetal position. Doctors will be in 10 minutes, so I tell him I'll get them to him as soon as they come in, but ask if he'll lie on his back for me to help his breathing. He tells me he won't make it until they get there and that he won't face the other way. OBS still all fine at this point, but he's more agitated, so again, I suggest he move position for comfort, and that's when he says, "I won't make it until the doctors get here. If I turn to face the other way, I'll die." He repeated this a few times to me, and he arrested literally as the doctors walked in, and he died on the side he'd been refusing to turn to. I'm convinced he knew, and me too. Number 3. Dying alone. This online user shared this story saying, "I work in a long-term care and one of my residents was dying from lung cancer. We knew it was going to happen any day and she did too, and she repeatedly stated that she didn't want to be all alone, so all Friday night nurses took turns sitting with her, and when I came in Saturday morning, they asked if I would sit with her. I worked in recreation. She was such a sweetheart and had no children, but had a niece who hardly visited, and when we called Friday, basically she said, 'Call me when she is dead.' Anyways, this lady was laboring to breathe, in and out of consciousness, but would always squeeze my hand if I squeezed hers. Finally, I whispered in her ear, 'The nurse just told me your niece is on the way.' She died less than 5 minutes later. She just wanted to know that someone was coming, but her niece never came." Now this is just really heartbreaking, but I'm glad someone was with her when she passed. Number 2. Help me. This Reddit user tells a story that stayed with them forever. They said, "My first code as a nurse was of a middle-aged mother who we think ended up having a brain bleed. I was trying to check her vitals and she was super agitated and had been all day. She managed to bend her IV pole somehow. She was ripping her gown off and sheets off the bed, and she'd yanked her heart monitor off. I was trying to start a blood transfusion but needed to get her vitals beforehand, which was impossible because she wouldn't stay still long enough for any of it to read. I'd given her a sedative for what we thought was anxiety and was praying it would kick in soon. She kept grabbing my arm saying, 'Come here, look at me, help me,' with a fear in her eyes that I will never forget. I'm pretty sure I snapped back, 'I'm trying,' which I of course wish was something comforting instead. Then she leaned back, her eyes got droopy, she shut her mouth, then snapped her eyes wide open but totally glossed over. She took one last breath as a coworker was helping me while I called the code." And coming in at number 1 is the Hat Man. The last one here is definitely the creepiest. This Reddit user said, "A nice old lady who told my CNA she wanted to wear all white. When asked why, she said the man in black is here. She looked in the corner of the room. The CNA looked, but there was no one there. That's when I came into the room. We asked her to describe what she was seeing, and she said he's in all black and he's got a top hat on. Then she whispered, 'And his eyes are red,' while her eyes moved across the room to directly behind the CNA like she was watching him move closer to us. She died later that night, but it was unexpected. That room creeped me out for a long time after that." Yeah, that room would creep me out forever because what do you mean the man in black wearing a top hat is here? I would freak out if I heard that. Well, that's all for part 2 of our list of the top 10 dark last words heard by nurses. Which one on our list creeped you out the most? Let us know in the comments down below, and while you're down there, why not like and subscribe? I'm your host Emily, and we'll see you next time. Peace.